Today, I'd like to take the opportunity to tell you a bit about the global state of the oceans, especially given the discussion of marine protected areas this past winter here in Australia in the election. But I wanted to start by asking you all a question. I want you to think back to the last time that you've gone snorkeling or diving or fishing in the oceans, and how big was the biggest fish that you actually saw. Now, I want you to also think back to, say, the first time that you've gone, or if you've got pictures of your parents or grandparents when they went diving, and how big was the biggest fish that they might have seen or caught. Well, chances are that what you're seeing today is much smaller than what they would have seen many years ago. And this is a nice way of illustrating this. These pictures, these series of pictures, were taken in one spot in the Florida Keys, where the sports fishermen come in to proudly display their catches for the day. And this is the kind of catches that they were getting in the 1950s, in the 1980s, and now this is what's being caught just a few years ago. This isn't just happening in this one particular spot in the Florida Keys, but it's actually a global phenomenon. And I'll illustrate this with a big fishery, big global fishery, commercial fishery, that's called the Japanese pelagic longline fishery, which is the fishery that catches a lot of the tunas and billfishes. This is a few years after the fishery started in the 1950s, where in the reds you see the places where there are lots and lots of catches, and in the blues, less so. A few years on, the fishery expands. Where they used to catch lots, they catch a lot less, and in other parts of the oceans where they've expanded too, the catches are a lot higher. This goes on to the early 60s, and then jumping to the 80s, you see very low catches all over the world, and this continues today. This phenomenon has been called fishing down the food web, and this happens because we humans think that the biggest fish are the tastiest and hence the most economically viable. So we fish those first, and when there aren't quite enough left of those to make it worth the while to go out, we fish the next ones down and the next ones down, which, if we continue, will lead us to a trajectory of having lots of small fishes, not a lot of complexity in the bottom, so the structures that help the fishes are actually destroyed, and lots of jellyfish. What this means to us here is that soon we may face the prospect of having to eat jellyfish sandwiches. And if you think this is joking for your culinary pleasures, I have a website here that points you to some nice recipes of what you can do with jellyfish. Now, all of this leads me to talking about the value of marine protected areas. Marine protected areas are places in the ocean that we set aside where fishing is not allowed or is much reduced. Places where fishing is completely excluded are also called no-take zones or marine reserves. And I wanted to focus on how these actually work, which brings me to having to talk about the birds and the bees of the fishes. So here's one example of coral trout. If you have a small fish, it produces comparatively few young, but as the fish gets bigger, it produces more, and with the biggest fish, you get exponentially more young or larvae that they produce. What this means is that by setting aside these protected areas, we allow the fish to get big. And this, of course, then means that not only are we protecting that particular fish, but with that many young, these larvae are going to disperse in the outside fishing areas. And hence, the purpose of these is not only to protect them for the sake of protecting fish, but to ultimately enable us to continue eating fish so that fisheries can continue outside. This brings me to what I also wanted to focus on, which is the title of my talk, The Changing Nature of Marine Protected Areas. Very few places in the ocean are actually protected. Globally, less than 1% of the ocean is in marine reserves, so there's still lots of talk about expanding marine protected areas. Now, what we've learned in doing this is that we actually do it slightly differently in what we used to, and one of the big lessons is that involving people means much better compliance, so that the situation that you see here doesn't actually happen. If you can't read it, there's a no fishing sign, and then you have all these people fishing on the pier. Now, as we've just heard in the previous presentation, there are, of course, lots and lots of stresses on the ocean, and I've only focused on the main one, or one of them, which is fishing. But of course, climate change, such as the changes we've already seen in sea surface temperature here, are also very important. So one of the key lessons that we're learning is that as we identify these new threats, and we also need to be quite adaptive in how we manage the oceans. And I wanted to bring all of this back to my initial question to you, which is about the fish in the ocean. If you want your kids and your grandchildren to still be able to see these really big fish, then marine protected areas are going to be a big part of that solution. And I haven't specifically talked about coral reefs here, but all of this is important not only for coral reefs, but globally as well. And the next presentation is going to focus more on what all of this means for coral reefs themselves. Thank you.